Well, great. Well, thank you all for being here. We appreciate it. We've been seeing a lot in the media about the youth mental health crisis. This is affecting kids, teens, the whole gamut across the spectrum. There's a lot of differing opinions on the role that tech and social media play in these issues. So we've got some very deep expertise at the table here. So I want to start with Dr. Alfie. Let's start with the basics.
Yeah.
What do you think actually constitutes an actual mental health problem? Like, what do you look for as a clinician?
So I think when I try to talk with parents, caregivers, because everybody who caregives for a young person is not their biological parent. And we know this is particularly true for certain populations more so than others. And I try to share with people from the perspective of diversity, equity, and inclusion, thinking about all of us, right? Whether you're a person of color and or LGBTQAI+ and or a person with a disability. So for all of us, I think those definitions are going to differ. So what I try to share with people is what's really important is to know your baseline. Right? When you're in a neutral heart space, what does that feel like? And then, we have signs and symptoms. We're all trained in this. We have signs and symptoms that we share with people. And so the idea of what constitutes a mental health concern or a mental health crisis is really understanding what those signs and symptoms are, understanding those in relationship to what is my baseline, what is my child's baseline, and looking at over time, right? Think about a 2-week period. Do you see drastic changes in their behavior? Right? So the idea that there's one tried and true method for all of us that universally defines what constitutes a mental health problem or crisis, I don't necessarily agree with that, because I think the literature really needs to catch up to how we all show up in the world, right? Across different points of diversity.
Yep.
That's what I would say.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. Any thoughts from either of you?
I completely agree. I think we are looking for one answer, and that's so much more satisfying, including about age and timing and what's going on with technology, but with everything related to mental health. And that's just not the direction that mental health needs to be in. It's not serving anyone. So I think figuring out how to get to know your child so that you can have a better relationship, especially if you're going in, for example, to speak with a clinician, is going to always bolster whatever interventions that we can do. And in general, it feels important for us to focus more on that relationship than looking for right age, right diagnosis, right anything.
Yep. That's great.
I think we struggle with the subjectivity of mental health.
Yep.
Because these symptoms were written by a bunch of people over a couple centuries to be behaviorally reliable, but with no objective markers and no real consideration of the culture and kind of the social circumstances from which they arose. So much of our work as clinicians is helping people to think about what Dr. Alfie referenced with the 2-week kind of period, trying to assess impairment, the frequency of symptoms, the intensity of them, how much they're affecting a child or a teen, but then at the same time understanding everything in context so that we can provide support where it's needed, whether or not we have a diagnosis.
Yeah, makes sense.
I love that.
So for Dr. Pressman, your recent book talks a lot about the 5 essentials. So particularly today, it'd be great to focus on the relationship part of the equation.
They're all ours.
Yeah, they're all ours, 5 R's.
I want to make it easy for everyone.
Yeah. What do you mean by this? And how should the audience here interpret that? And what does that do as related to social media, screen time, et cetera as well?
Yeah.
Well, I think first, the 5 principles in the book are relationship, reflection, regulation, rules, and repair. And yes, I made them all ours, but they're rooted in the science. So it's not like they're my principles. They're just the principles that we know we can do something about them. I mean, the most important thing to me was, what is something that a parent or caregiver actually has control over? We have control over ourselves on a good day, so let's focus on the principles in the science that actually move the needle on resilience. And relationship, of course, I mean, I think it's Jack Shonkoff who says, there is no development without relationship. And so cultivating a close connected relationship, and relationship could mean so many different things. You've definitely read about how powerful relationships are, but it might have been, called attachment relationship or connection or attunement, but it's all part of this umbrella of how well do we know each other? Do we feel seen? Does our child feel like they are loved for exactly who they are? And I think, to me, in the context of social media, because I think everyone's pretty terrified right now, thinking about this beautiful understanding and power of relationship. So when we think about relationship, even the fact that, I hope this is heartening and not scary, but we know that toxic stress is something that is linked with poor health outcomes and mental health outcomes in the long term, and it's pretty terrifying. And what I think is so heartening when you hear things like that is that stressors that are in the context of a close connected relationship move from the category of toxic stress to tolerable stress, which actually has capacity to grow resilience. And then, of course, there's positive stressors, which are just like, you're not allowed to have your phone at night. That's going to make your kid upset, and it's going to feel quite stressful, and also that's okay. It's critical for resilience building to have positive stressors. But what I think is so heartening about relationship is, if it has the power to buffer the impact of toxic stress and move the categorization of that experience into tolerable, then we don't have to feel so helpless and terrified, because that we can do something about.
If you don't mind, maybe talk about it in the context of social media, technology, and how should we think about that part of it?
So getting to know your kids, getting to know your adolescents, getting to know their friends, and really having open conversations, because you're not lecturing, you're not just sort of like, this is all terrible, and so I'm just taking it away because I panicked and read something, or I'm scared of you feeling uncomfortable, so I'm going to let you have this because you've said that you're going to feel left out, or whatever it is. When you can say, I know you, I hear you, I empathize. It's really hard to be a kid, especially an emerging adolescent and an adolescent. And so tell me a little bit about what you're looking for. Tell me what tell me what your peers are looking at. Show me what's going on. Check out the algorithm together. If you do have a teenager on social media, let them share with you kind of what's on their mind, what does the algorithm think is interesting for them, and open up conversations. And that's it does so much more than it sounds like. It sounds so simple, but actually having those conversations and being less of a talker and more of a listener is going to help. And then when you're setting boundaries and you have those rules, they mean something different.
Yeah. Can I add something?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
I wonder if there's also, in addition to everything Dr. Pressman shared, there's also the context of, when we think about generations, right? I'm Gen X. I happen to be Gen X. And I think about millennial. Beautiful. Go Gen X. Millennial. And I think about millennial. I think that there's a different relationship for parents and caregivers to teenagers, being a Gen X parent, parenting Gen Z and younger, than being a millennial parent and parenting. Because if you think about the advent of social media, we didn't grow up with that, right? I remember when I got my first cell phone. Yes, I am that old. But you know what I mean? And I've had the same phone number for 20 some odd years, right? So I think the idea that for millennial parents, it might be a little different because they have a different relationship to social media. I think about when I look at many millennial parents, not all, I think about how much of their lives they're comfortable sharing on social media. That's not my experience as a Gen Xer. And of course, not all Gen Xers are the same. So I think there's also something about the ways in which we as parents and caregivers can relate to our young people around social media. If I think again about Gen Xers, and I happen to be an African-American woman, I'm thinking about people who are my peers. I don't know that they're gonna sit down and have those conversations with their kids. I think it's the right thing to do.
Yep.
And so I wonder about, how do we help parents and caregivers have tools to allow them to do what Dr. Pressman shared, but in the absence of that, what else can you do? Right? So I just think about parents who come from different socioeconomic backgrounds. Maybe they're working a lot. Maybe they don't have time to sit with their child. But is there a way that they can form some kind of bond where they can check in and monitor what their child is doing that way? So everything Dr. Pressman said, I agree with totally. And I think that there's some importance to understanding that for different family structures, there are going to be nuances that we want to pay attention to as well.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. So here's one for Dr. Dave. The Child Mind Institute, it's focused on what's called positive parenting. What can parents do to keep things positive? And it's often perceived as a generational divide. So how do we navigate through that?
I mean, literally, we wrote that question about generational divide, and then Dr. Alfie's hitting up the millennial and Gen X, and we're talking about the conversations. I'm like, yes. No, our focus on kind of positive strategies is centered around this kind of idea. I look back a lot of times, a colleague of mine, Dr. Yelda Ulz out in LA, oftentimes compares the advent of the internet age to the advent of other technologies. She'll often show in talks an article that was written about steam engines and how they were unfortunately making communities more distant and making it so we couldn't communicate with each other as well, and they were ripping apart the fabric of American society. And then I think also about cars and the fact that when cars came about in this country at the beginning of the 20th century, there were movements where people protested in the streets, mourners walking through the streets because of the pedestrians that cars had hit and the ways that people had died in cars. And so I think about how can we take those lessons of history, the fact that the internet is here to stay, which as a millennial, I feel like I can say. I spent most of my time waiting on America Online Instant Messenger for my crush to show up. But, it's something where if it's here to stay, how do we get parents a playbook that helps them to have the strategies they need, instead of saying, like, we want to put the genie back in the bottle? Because, again, with cars, we did it as a society. Cars came about. There were deaths of pedestrians. There were deaths of passengers. And we looked at seatbelts and airbags and car seats and made it so that we can, at some level, manage the risk in something that is going to have some inherent risk, but we also agree is going to be part of our society. And this is where digital media has risk. We know that for certain groups of kids, we want parents to be aware of the risks for certain kids who struggle with certain mental health and learning disorders. We want parents to be aware of the kinds of things that they need to think about content, about cyberbullying, about hate that happens online. Once they know about those things, it then goes to, I think, what Dr. Pressman was referring to, which is how do we get parents a checklist of what they do on the positive side, the things to actually do. We'll often focus on the other developmental tasks. We'll say, in the time your child is not spending on screens, are they invested in school? Do they have real-life friendships? Are they getting enough sleep? If we can kind of do a checklist of some of those daily wellness habits and then return to screen time after we've done a good inventory of the rest of our lives, then we can think, okay, where do the seatbelts need to be? Where do the airbags need to be? How do we need to move toward that as a society? And then beyond that, how do we experience this with our children in whatever context and format or amount of time a parent might have?
Yeah, let me ask you something a little bit sort of off our list here. So in the context of sort of setting up safe guardrails for kids, it seems a little controversial where you talk to some parents and they say, it's actually great that there's some social media availability because my child is shy. In real life, they're not able to engage with folks. And then if they are in a group and there's a lot of friends on the groups, et cetera. So where are the guardrails? Is it the amount of time they're spending online, quality of interactions, or how do you think about that?
I think we all could probably reference different guardrails if you want to go.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the first thing is just to your point, like what are they doing when they're not online? So a lot of times we fixate on minutes online, minutes spent doing something on social media. And if you think about what's happening in a day and are those things happening, the sleep is, to me, number one. I think we all kind of, that's sort of a universal feeling. But getting outside, getting exercise, doing, having real life interactions, going to school, like all of the things that happen outside of screen time, are those things happening? If they are, it doesn't leave as much time to get into those really long patterns of looking and ruminating and scrolling and screen time. So that's the first thing is, what are they doing instead of being online, instead of fixating on this minutia? Because you get in the arguments and then parents have controls over phone time and then they get asked 7,000 times, like, can I get an extra 2 minutes? Can I get an extra 2 minutes? And then that's what the relationship becomes about.
Yeah, I mean, I was just joking that that's the only time I hear from my 15-year-old
When it's time.
requesting time.
Right.
So can I get more time? I say, oh, well, how was your day? It's like, it was good. Can I have more time? That's like the entire
Can I have more time? Yeah, I think it's also what are they doing, right? Because I think about some kids where online is the safe space, right? I think about for queer kids, that's the community. I think about for many kids of color, that's the community. That's where they can see themselves reflected positively. So the other thing for me is, what kind of communication is happening between parents and kids? Not around that specifically, but in general. So one of the things I share with parents is, stop asking your kids, no shade, I don't mean it in a bad way because I do it too, how was your day? right? Instead, ask them, right? Because that's fine,
Yeah.
right? We all know that they're gonna get fined. That's what we used to do.
Yeah.
But I wonder if there's a way to say things like, tell me something good that happened in your day-to-day.
Yeah.
Tell me something bad that happened in your day-to-day. You still gonna get, and can I get more screen time? Tacked on to the end of that.
We got
But
a
I
bit
think
of-
it sort of fosters and facilitates a conversation. So I think, in addition to what my colleagues are saying, it's what are they using it for? Because I'm thinking about a queer kid who's living somewhere where there are not a lot of other LGBTQAI plus kids. This is where I'm, and if you don't have that support in the home, this is where I'm going to get the support. So it's not to say that it's always like that, but I think those keys of how are you communicating with your child, and what are they using it for, and do you as a caregiver have a sense of what they're using that screen time for? And then I learned this from, I'm just going to tell my biases, the Obamas, the screen time thing. When I had, my kids are 19, my daughter's going to be on a panel later in 17. The idea of during the school week, we limit screen time on the weekend, but that's just what works for us. I know they're all different constellations, but I found that to be helpful.
So it's hard to follow the Obamas. I'm just going to throw it out there. So, Michelle and Barack are doing something. I don't know what boundaries I'm going to set up. But no, the bottom line is when I think about boundaries, a lot of the first answers that we give parents is we'll say time. We know that more than 3 hours a day, which sounds insane, is incredibly injurious in the sense that we don't know that it's causal. Like the kids who are spending 4 hours a day online, it's usually there's something else involved in the system. We don't necessarily know if the social media or the mental health struggles the kid might be having are kind of bi-directional or what's going on. We just know if it's 3 hours, that's a problem. We want parents to think about content and privacy, but this is like the first couple months of your kid engaging with the internet. Because as you're having those conversations about internet or social media, and you're talking to a child about content or privacy or the amount of time they can spend, then it comes down to the conversation we're actually having, which is what they're doing when they're online. And I like to think about it in terms of social skills. How do we take real-world social skills and move them online and help kids to understand what the norms are there and what we'd like to see from them, related to the comments that they're making, the way that they're interacting, who they're interacting with. Like we have stranger danger at the playground. That's something to think about with privacy online. We have ways of interacting and following certain accounts. The ways that you direct message certain people. And this is where we need these more detailed playbooks where parents read that first article, they say, okay, I've got the first conversation, but now my kid's on social media. So things like our Positive Parenting Thriving Kids curriculum or the Digital Parenthood website that's going to be set up after this summit with many guides and videos of all of us. It's kind of what are the next conversations look like? What's the next obstacle you need to look at? And if you're not going to be a digital expert, how can we at least give you the information to ask interesting questions like, what's one of the best things you saw on Instagram today that provoked thought?
That's right.
Makes a lot of sense. And one for you, Dr. Alfie. When we're thinking about sort of mental health issues, I think you mentioned that for different communities it's a little bit different. I think you mentioned that you're doing some research looking at the negative effects of social media use and it being more harmful to certain communities than other ones. So tell us a little bit about your findings. What are you learning? How can we
Thank you for that. So I run something called the ACOMA Project. And at ACOMA, we're focused on 3 things: raising consciousness, empowering people, and changing the system of mental health. Our focus is diverse young people, right? And when we talk about diversity, we're talking about all aspects of who our young people are, because they're not either a child with a disability or a person of color or LGBTQIA+, or a person of color. They're all of those things. And so in our research, we found, for example, this is the stat that I remember off the top of my head, we did something called the State of Mental Health of Youth of Color. We did an executive summary in 2022, a full report in 2023. 3,000 young people of color, 5 racial ethnic groups, multiracial, Latino, Latina, AAPI, yes, we included Pacific Islander young people, African American, Black, and Native American Indigenous young people. And what we found was that about 40% of all of these young people report some sort of racial harassment that they experienced online. They also talk about not seeing enough people who look like them. We also found things like where these young people were describing what we call racial trauma, exposure to racial trauma, and significant proportions of each of these groups, right? And so when you layer on identities, for our Native American young people who identify as queer, like almost all the kids in our sample with those qualities reported having moderate to high anxiety, right? So there's something about the experience where it's safe in some places, but it can be damaging in others. And so these conversations, I'm sure everybody out here has heard of the talk.
Yeah.
The talk is something that we talk about in the Black community. I'm sure it applies to other communities where you're doing racial socialization. You are preparing your Black male child for what it means to go be out in the world and to keep himself safe. Right? And as a Black mom, worrying about this boy every time he leaves the house. My son's name is Miles. Like just when he goes to the store. These are the kinds of things we want to be able to equip, parents and caregivers of diverse, all backgrounds, to be able to have conversations with their young people about. So again, it comes down to, are we aware ourselves as parents and caregivers of what's stressing us out? Are we dealing with racial trauma? Are we dealing with LGBTQAI plus stress or stress around having a disability? And how then do we communicate safely to our children in the context of what they're consuming on social media to keep them protected?
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. One for Dr. Anderson. A little bit, maybe talk to us about neurodivergent setups versus people that, are sort of, much more sort of part of the norm.
Yeah.
And challenges with anxiety, particularly for neurodivergent kids, eating issues, because it seems like there's a lot of comorbidity between those situations. So,
I mean, when we talk about the intersection of mental health diagnoses and tech, for a lot of parents, we try to remind parents of is when you look at surveys of teens and the experience that they have online, the vast majority of teens say that their experiences are positive in most cases.
Yep.
Now, this is not to say that when we talk about asking them if they've had a single incidence of witnessing hate speech or witnessing discrimination or racism toward themselves, they absolutely almost unanimously say the same, that they've experienced that. But then if you look at any single incident of kind of behavior online, teens are saying they're mostly positive. That said, when we talk about kids who are in these kind of vulnerable groups, and I think we've been talking about a couple different ways that we can think about those intersections. Kids who have ADHD, kids who have depression, kids who have body image difficulties or kind of eating-related difficulties, what we know from the literature is that exposure to certain online forums or certain themes online can exacerbate symptoms. And certain communities online can also create communities of belonging, similar to what we were talking about the life-saving aspects of LGBTQ communities online at times. So we want to be thinking about that interplay where, for example, I specialize in kids with ADHD. I know for a fact that if we don't place some level of boundary on homework time in the afternoon, particularly for kids up through the end of middle school, it is very unlikely, I'm more likely than not to have a parent in my office saying, I can't control it. They're on YouTube, or they're on social media, or they're on some sort of internet website, or he's read every story on Bleacher Report, or we're playing a video game. How do I stop this during homework time? Because he needs a computer to do this, or she needs her phone to be able to be on FaceTime on a group project, but then I don't know when it ends. And so a lot of this is us thinking about the intersection of the symptoms with the technology. With depression, it's time. It's that the intervention for depression is behavioral activation. That's front line for teens, is just getting them out and doing something. Taking a walk to the grocery store, just getting out of the apartment, whatever it might be. And so if a kid is inside on screens, they can't behaviorally activate. And we know that symptoms might get worse. And then going back to kind of body image issues, it's this question of what behaviors are being promoted. We see lots of online personalities saying, here's an evidence-based strategy to manage your ADHD. Here's how you can engage in an acceptance-focused perspective around your body. We also see people forming communities of belonging around habits of anorexia. And those are the moments where we want kids to think about what's coming through your feed, can you control it, can you actively search for communities of belonging?
That makes a lot of sense. So I think we're coming up, we probably have time for one more question, so it's a final question for all three of you. If you could leave the parents and advocates here with one strategy or a piece of advice on helping their kids navigate the digital world, what would that be?
I mean, to me, no matter what, no screens at bedtime or a little bit before bedtime, no matter how passionately they feel they need those screens. And that is so hard because there are so many different reasons, whether it's FaceTime and group projects or missing out or whatever. In the same way, back in our day with the Gen Xers, like you couldn't sit on you can explain like any limit that you have, but that one guarantees that if they are staying up all night, it's because they're just so bored. They're under their covers with, a flashlight and a book. And then I feel like they'll bore themselves to sleep eventually. Yeah. So that would be the number one thing, and not plugged in across the room, but actually you get into a habit of, I keep the phone, and we model that for our kids because we do it ourselves.
I'll be brief. There's a saying within behavioral science, and I'm a behaviorist: I do, we do, you do. I try to think of every way that I can address that particular principle with my own children and with patients. Is how do I think first about what I'm doing and what I'm modeling? How do we do something together? And then how do we get to a point of trust and independence where I can give a kid that reinforcement of autonomy and feeling like they're capable, but only after we feel fairly confident they can navigate that world and make critical decisions.
Yeah, I think I would just add that for all of us, we have to trust ourselves, and we have to trust that we have the capacity to do this work. So I get a little more abstract, right? And so what I ask parents and caregivers to do is to think about, what would you want somebody to say to you to convince you to change your behavior? And that's this kind of stuff that we should be saying to our young people. So I just want parents and caregivers to know you can do it. You got some tools, you have it in you, and the goal is just to go out and try to do something different with your young person.
Amazing. Thank you so much. We really appreciate the time.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Okay.